Welcome back to Irregular Mind and episode 2 of our series, US History Understanding this Country. If you are joining us for the first time, don't worry, we will start with a quick recap of what we covered last time. In the first episode, we explored the incredible civilizations that existed in the Americas long before Europeans arrived. From the Olmecs, Mayas, Aztecs, and Incas to the mound builders and Pueblo people, we saw how diverse and innovative these cultures were. We also touched on the Vikings' voyage to the Vinland, the age of exploration, and how advances in navigation and technology opened up the seas for European expansion. Now, let us pick up the thread and dive into the geopolitical landscape of Western Europe during the late 15th century, the backdrop to the one of history's most famous voyages. I would recommend you play the previous episode in case you are interested. I hope you will like my podcast and recommend it to others if you like the content of this podcast. Let us look at the race for riches in Western Europe in 15th century. The late 1400s were the time of ambition and rivalry in Europe. Nations like Spain, Portugal, England, and France were hungry for wealth and power. Trade routes to Asia were the key to unlocking riches. Spices, silk, and gold were in high demand. But overland routes through the Middle East were costly and controlled by powerful Islamic empires. Portugal had already started exploring alternative sea routes under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator. By 1488, Bartholomew Diaz had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and in 1497, Vasco da Gama reached India. A little trivia here: Gama reached Kerala, a South Indian state, which is my home state. Back to the story. But Spain, a newly unified kingdom after the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella and the conclusion of Reconquista, didn't want to be left behind. Enter Christopher Columbus, an ambitious Genoese sailor with a radical idea. Why not reach Asia by sailing west? In 1492, after years of pitching his plan and facing rejection, Columbus finally secured funding from Spain's Catholic monarchs. With three ships, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, and about 90 men, Columbus set sail in August of that year, aiming for Asia but destined to do something entirely different. After weeks of uncertainty and grumbling from his crew, land was finally sighted on October 12, 1492. Columbus had reached an island in the Bahamas, which he named San Salvador. Believing he had found the islands off the coast of Asia, Columbus referred to the indigenous inhabitants as Indians. Columbus' arrival marked a pivotal moment in history. He and his crew marveled at the lush landscapes and hospitality of the indigenous people. The locals, part of Taino culture, welcomed the Europeans with curiosity, offering food, gold ornaments, and friendship. But Columbus didn't see this as a cultural exchange. He saw opportunity. His journals reveal a man intent to claiming land, converting souls to Christianity, and finding wealth. He quickly planted the Spanish flag and began mapping the region. Over the next few months, Columbus explored other islands including present-day Cuba and Hispaniola. He was convinced he had found the gateway to Asia, though the land and people were unlike anything Europeans ever imagined. Columbus left behind a small settlement, La Navidad on Hispaniola, before returning to Spain in early 1493. He brought with him Taino captives, exotic goods, and stories of vast potential wealth. The Spanish crown, thrilled by the news, quickly funded additional voyages, setting the stage for further exploration and colonization. But for the indigenous people, Columbus' arrival signaled the beginning of profound and often devastating changes. The exchange of goods, ideas, and diseases would reshape the Americas forever, a topic we'll delve deeper in future episodes. Spain quickly realized the islands in the Caribbean were just the beginning. Sure, these places offered gold, new crops, and enslaved labor, but explorers like Hernan Cortes and Francisco Pizarro had heard whispers of vast wealthy empires waiting on the mainland. By 1519, Cortes landed on the shores of Mexico and found himself face to face with Aztec Empire, a thriving civilization with massive cities, advanced engineering, and armies of warriors. A few years later, Pizarro would encounter the Inca Empire in South America, an equally impressive powerhouse high in Andes Mountains. So, how did a handful of Spanish conquistadors take down these mighty empires? Let's break it down. The question here is why the great Mesoamerican cultures fell to Spain. Alliances and divide and conquer. The Aztec and Inca empires weren't as united as they appeared. Cortes made clever alliances with indigenous groups who resented the Aztecs, particularly because of their demands for tribute and human sacrifices. Similarly, Pizarro exploited divisions among the Inca, who were already weakened by a civil war over royal succession. Secondly, superior weapons and horses. The Spanish had steel swords, cannons, and firearms far superior to the obsidian blades and spears used by Aztec and Incas. They also brought horses, which were terrifying and unfamiliar to indigenous people. Now, this one is huge. European diseases like smallpox and measles spread like wildfire among native population. They had no immunity. By the time the Spanish arrived in full force, millions had already died, leaving their civilizations vulnerable. The Aztecs and Inca were deeply spiritual and sometimes saw Spanish as gods, or at least as messengers of a divine power. For example, the Aztec Emperor Montezuma II initially welcomed Cortes, mistaking him for the returning god Quetzalcoatl. This hesitation gave the Spanish time to plan their attacks. The worst of all, the conquistadors were relentless in their pursuit of wealth and power. They didn't just come to trade or explore, they came to conquer. Apart from all these, the Spanish had the power of knowledge, the power of science. Back in Europe, navigators and astronomers had access to advanced star charts and eclipse predictions. Thanks to the work of scientists like Johannes Muller, these charts provided precise dates of celestial events like solar eclipses. The story goes like this. The leader of the conquistadors realizes that total solar eclipse is about to occur. Armed with this knowledge, he hatches a bold and deeply manipulative plan. He gathers the indigenous leaders and tells them something terrifying. The Spanish god is angry. The proof: soon the sun will vanish from the sky as the sign of the divine wrath. Unless the natives immediately submit themselves to the Spaniards, they will all suffer the consequences. The day arrives. Just as predicted, the moon begins to move across the face of sun. The sky darkens, the air cools, and the day turns into night. For the indigenous people who have no reason to understand the astronomical mechanics behind an eclipse, this must have seemed like a horrifying supernatural event. Panic spreads. Terrified, the natives beg the Spaniards for forgiveness and agree to provide them with whatever they need. The Spanish, satisfied that their bluff has worked, smugly accept the offerings and promise to make peace with their god. As the moon continues its journey and sun reappears, the Spanish claim victory, cementing their authority over the indigenous people, at least for a time. This story is a powerful example of how knowledge can be weaponized. The Spanish didn't invent eclipse. Of course, they used their understanding of celestial mechanics, a science unknown to the indigenous people at that time, as a way to dominate and exploit. It's chilling reminder of how ignorance can be exploited and how science, which is meant to enlighten, can also be twisted to serve darker purposes. The famous astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson often shares this story to highlight the value of scientific literacy. This tale also serves a metaphor for history itself. By learning about the past, its triumphs, and its tragedies, we empower ourselves to resist the mistakes of those who came before us. So, as we continue this journey through the history, let's carry that lesson with us. Knowledge is power, yes, but how we use it matters even more. Now let's get back to the history of US. Let's zoom out for a moment. The Spanish weren't just bringing soldiers and guns. Their arrival sets off one of the biggest cultural, biological, and economic exchanges in history. It's called the Columbian Exchange, and it reshaped both old and new worlds. Let's quickly have a look at what is this Columbian Exchange. Let us see what came to the Americas. 1. Animals. Horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep transformed farming and transportation. The Europeans brought in crops like wheat, rice, sugarcane, and coffee plants. All these things became staple here. Diseases. The smallpox, measles, and influenza. These devastated the indigenous people. And it's not only what Europeans brought to the America, it's also about what they took from here. Of course, the crops that indigenous people already had here, like corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and cocoa, they became the global game changers. Imagine Italian food without tomatoes or Irish history without potatoes. Isn't it hard to picture? Another game changer was tobacco, a new world product that took Europe by storm. Europeans took gold and silver. The massive amount of wealth flowed into Spain and reshaped European economies. The Columbian Exchange wasn't just about goods, it was about people and ideas too. Unfortunately, many of these cultural exchanges weren't peaceful. Indigenous way of life were uprooted, their land taken, and their spiritual practices suppressed. At the same time, new cultural fusions began to emerge. For example, indigenous farming techniques influenced European settlers, while African traditions brought by enslaved people became part of America's cultural fabric. This blending created something new, but it came at an immense cost. When the Spanish and Portuguese arrived in Americas, they needed labor to extract resources, build settlements, and grow cash crops like sugarcane. At first, they tried to enslave the indigenous people. But as we have seen, diseases like smallpox wiped out much of the native population. Those who survived often resisted or fled into vast landscapes they knew far better than the Europeans. In response, the colonizers turned to another source, Africa. The transatlantic slave trade began as European traders brought millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas. These men, women, and children were ripped off their homelands, chained in horrific conditions, and forced to work in brutal environments. Enslaved Africans worked primarily on plantations in Caribbean, Brazil, and later in the southern parts of what would become United States. Their labor became the backbone of the colonial economy. The plantation system depended on their expertise, especially in growing sugar, cotton, and tobacco, the very crops that drove the wealth of European empires. Let's talk about someone who stood up against the horrors of this system, Bartolome de las Casas, a Spanish priest who started out like many of his peers, benefiting from the indigenous labor. But something changed. Las Casas became one of the first Europeans to speak out against the exploitation of indigenous people, calling it a sin and an injustice. His writings, including a short account on destruction of the Indies, painted a gruesome picture of the violence and suffering inflicted on native communities. Las Casas advocated for reform, pushing for laws to protect indigenous people from enslavement and abuse. In 1542, partly because of his efforts, Spain passed the new laws, which aimed to end enslavement of indigenous people and improve their treatment. On paper, it was a huge step forward, but in practice, enforcement was weak and many colonists ignored or actively resisted these laws. And here is the twist. Lacazas also suggested using enslaved Africans as an alternative labor source, believing they might withstand the harsh conditions better than the indigenous people. He later regretted this stance, realizing it only shifted the suffering to another group. His legacy is complicated, but his fight for justice planted seeds that would grow in future human rights movements. Now, let us connect the dots to something even larger. It's called the Triangle Trade, a system that linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas. It is a brutal cycle of profit and suffering. Here is how it works. The first step is Europe to Africa. Ships left European ports loaded with manufactured goods like textiles, guns, and alcohol. These were traded in Africa for enslaved people. And the second step comes in Africa to the Americas. This was the infamous Middle Passage, where enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic in overcrowded, horrific conditions. Millions died in these voyages. And then the third part, the Americas to Europe. In the Americas, enslaved people were forced to produce goods like sugar, cotton, tobacco, and whatnot. These were shipped back to the Europe, completing the triangle. This system fueled the rise of European empires and made some individuals fabulously wealthy, but it came at an unimaginable human cost. By the 1700s, the transatlantic slave trade was a massive industry, and its legacy would haunt Americas long after the trade itself ended. As we are close to the wrap up of this episode, let us pause to reflect on systemic slavery of that time. Slavery wasn't just a practice, it was an institution woven deeply into the fabric of the Americas. It dehumanized millions, reducing people to commodities whose lives were valued only for their labor. The brutality began long before enslaved Africans even reached the Americas. The Middle Passage, the second leg of the triangle trade, was one of the darkest chapters in the history. Imagine being torn from your home and marched to the coast, where you crammed onto a ship with hundreds of others. The space is so tight that you can barely move. The air is stifling and the smell unbearable, and the conditions inhuman. You are fed just enough to stay alive and beaten into submission if you resist. For the millions who endured this journey, the Middle Passage was a living nightmare. Ships were packed tight to maximize profits, with people treated as a cargo, not human beings. Disease spread rapidly, killing many of them before they even reached the Americas. And yet, for the captains and the traders, the loss of life was just the cost of doing business. When survivors finally disembarked into the New World, their ordeal wasn't over. It was only a beginning. They faced lives of relentless labor, separation from their families, and constant threat of violence. Slavery became the foundation of colonial economy, particularly in the Caribbean and southern colonies of North America. Sugarcane, cotton, tobacco. These crops generated immense wealth, but only at the expense of human suffering. And here is a terrible truth. This system wasn't just about the cruelty by individuals. It was backed by laws, religious justifications, and societal norms. Entire governments and economies were structured to sustain and expand slavery. It's difficult to talk about, but it is essential to understanding how the Americas were shaped and how these injustices ripple through history even today. As heavy as this topic is, it's only part of the larger story of the Americas. While systemic slavery was a tragedy, it unfolded alongside other monumental changes. The European influx into the newly discovered continents brought explorers, settlers, colonists, each driven by ambition, greed, or dreams of a better life. In the next episode, we will dive into the European migration. How did Spanish, French, Dutch, and English carved out their territory? What was life like in these early settlements? And how did these colonies shape the future United States? Until then, thank you for joining me on this journey through history. Remember, the past may not be pretty, but understanding it helps us make sense of where we are today. Stay curious, and I'll see you next time on Irregular Mind. Thank you.